On July 10th, 1559, two men faced each other in the lists. On one side, King Henry II of France, on the other, Gabriel de Lorge, Count of Montgomery. Spurring on their great steeds of war, they clashed. The lances broke, but a splinter from the Count's lance entered the king's eye. Doctors, unable to perform effective surgery, opted to wait it out and hope for the best. 10 days later, King Henry II passed, and with him, royal jousting in France ended. For 500 years, medieval tournaments were the elite sport of medieval Europe, even though it killed noble sons and kings. But where and when did this tradition start? Why did people partake, and why did it all end? We'll answer all these questions and more in this video. Chapter 1. How it started. The origins of the medieval tournament are murky and difficult to pinpoint. The most common origin story leads us to Godfrey de Preuilly in 1066, who purportedly died in a tournament of his own making. But this was recorded almost 2 centuries after his death, and historians mostly dismiss this as a local legend. However, the legend did get 2 things more or less right. Tournaments originated in what is now northwestern France and Belgium, and they started somewhere in the late 11th century or early 12th century. What we call a tournament probably grew out of older, messy cavalry exercises and mock wars, and only slowly hardened into something with recognizable rules and formats. We don't actually know what the first tournament was. No chronicler sat down and wrote, "On this day the first tournament was held." By the time our sources notice them, tournaments are already a normal part of aristocratic life. We know this because the first solid mentions come from the early 1100s, in peace laws from Count Baldwin III of Hainaut and in the writings of Otto of Freising. What's important here is that these sources don't explain what tournaments are. They assume people already know. They just regulate them or warn against them. That tells us tournaments were already common by that point, and common enough that authorities felt they needed controlling. So why did tournaments catch on here, in this specific region? Because this part of Europe, the borderlands between France, Flanders, and the Low Countries, was packed with young, armed men who had a serious problem. In a noble family, the eldest son inherited the estate. Younger sons got training, a horse, weapons, but no land, because it was scarce, and no land meant no income. Some sources call them aristocratic vagabonds. These border counties were also politically fragmented and constantly competing. Lots of minor lords, lots of rivalries, and no single authority strong enough to shut down armed gatherings. Tournaments gave these restless men a legal outlet and a chance to turn skill with a lance into money and reputation. The earliest format was the Mêlée, a mock battle. 2 teams of knights, sometimes hundreds strong, assembled between villages. On a signal, they charged across open fields and smashed into each other. After the first impact, they wheeled their horses and went again. That turning, tournoyer in Old French, gives us the word tournament. The goal was capture. If you unhorsed a knight or forced them to yield, you could claim his horse, his armor, and ransom money from his family. In a world where a good warhorse cost a fortune, a successful day at a tournament could change your life. That was ultimately the main driver that made tournaments explode. Chapter 2. Making it a career. No one rode this system better than William Marshal. Born around 1146 as the 4th son of a minor noble, William started life with almost nothing. He had the blood, but as we mentioned, a big motivation: no land. As a child, he was used as a hostage during his father's rebellion and nearly hanged for it. Later, he was sent to Tonquerville in Normandy to learn the knightly trade: riding, weapons, and courtly manners. When he was finally knighted, he learned very quickly what tournaments were really about. After one early skirmish, his lord asked him how much loot he'd taken. William said he'd fought bravely, but hadn't captured anyone. In that world, that meant he actually fought badly. So William threw himself into tournaments. His biography, the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, describes him in vivid terms. charging into the mêlée like a lion among cattle. In one famous season on the circuit, he and his partner Roger de Gaugy captured 103 knights. Each knight meant ransom money. Each horse and suit of armor could be claimed and sold. But tournaments were also about the prix, a word that meant both prize and prestige. William understood that perfectly. He didn't hoard everything. He shared winnings and released some captives on generous terms. That made people talk about him in exactly the right way. But the physical cost was brutal. After one especially hard tournament, William was found with his helmet crushed so badly around his head that a blacksmith had to lay his head on an anvil and hammer the helm off while he was still wearing it. But this risky venture paid off. William climbed from landless younger son of Earl of Pembroke, married a great heiress, advised kings, and ended his life as Regent of England. For him, the tournament was his job, his business model, and his ticket from spare son to great man. Chapter 3. The people who made it work. Knights got the songs and the statues, but behind every shattered lance there was a small army doing the unglamorous work. Let's start with squires. These were teenage boys of noble birth, training to become knights. At tournaments, they did everything: cleaning armor, checking straps, hauling spare lances, and saddling fresh horses. During a mêlée, squires waited in fenced safe zones called receipts. When a knight rode back, battered and exhausted, they'd swarm him. They'd tear off his dented helm, relace torn mail, hand him a fresh shield, throw him onto a new horse, and send him right back into the fight. These boys were apprentices learning exactly how hard being a knight is. Then there were the craftsmen like armorers, saddle makers, and metal workers. As tournaments evolved, so did the equipment. Saddles grew taller with massive backs that locked a rider in place. Plate armor became more specialized, for example with extra reinforcement on the left side, face grills drilled with viewing holes, and trick shields designed to shatter and show a hit to the crowd. Then there were the horse trainers. Tournament war horses, or just war horses in general, known as destriers, were massive, powerful, and prohibitively expensive. And they had to be trained to do something completely unnatural for a horse: charge directly at another horse and rider and hold their ground at impact. And that training took years. Next, the heralds. Heralds started as messengers, but by the High Middle Ages they'd become tournament professionals. For example, they memorized coats of arms and family trees. In the chaos of a mêlée, they could glance at a shield and know exactly who the knight was and what his reputation was. They announced competitors, they tracked who unhorsed whom, and they helped decide who deserved le prix, the prize for best performance. And afterwards, they told the story. Heralds were medieval referees, statisticians, and sport journalists all wrapped into one human. And then there were the women. At the Smithfield tournament in 1390 in London, high-ranking ladies watched from special viewing areas and publicly awarded the prize to the best foreign knight. In Paris in 1389, heralds and ladies together judged that the best jouster was King Charles VI himself in disguise. The politics were obvious, but so was the role women played in legitimizing the result. Chivalric riders constantly linked prowess in combat with worthiness in love. Geoffroy de Tourneys, a great French knight of the 14th century, warned that a man without prowess would feel the shame that ends love affairs. Combat, romance, and status were all tangled together. I actually made a video about medieval romance literature. You should check it out. There's a link in the description. According to the poems and romance writers, knights fought for the love of a lady. And according to the sources, ladies did a lot more than just sit there looking impressed. They were judges, arbiters of reputation, and essential to the legitimacy of the tournament itself. Chapter 4. Kings and Power. If young knights saw the tournament as a career ladder, kings saw something else: a stage. By the late 14th century, major rulers were using tournaments to send political messages. We already mentioned the 1390 Smithfield tournament in London. This was a lavish tournament organized by Richard II of England. He'd survived years of political turmoil, and now he appeared in polished armor surrounded by choreographed pageantry with his queen and great ladies judging the fighters. This was a way to reassert royal authority. In June 1520, Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France met near Calais at the Field of Cloth of Gold. For over 2 weeks they competed in displays of wealth and athleticism, feasts, temporary palaces, wrestling, archery, and tournaments. Observers wrote about the two young kings striving to show personal vigor and physical courage. The jousting lists were as important as the negotiation table. No one leaned into this philosophy harder than the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. He loved tournaments so much he commissioned entire illustrated volumes showing him breaking lances and fighting in exotic armors. These books mixed reality and myth. They created a persona, Maximilian as the last knight embodying chivalry at the edge of the gunpowder age. Historian William Marshal argues that in the German lands, tournaments functioned as political education. They taught nobles how to form factions, how to cooperate in teams, how to display hierarchy, and how to negotiate honors and slights, all under the excuse of playing at war. By the 15th and the early 16th centuries, the tournament was a tool of statecraft, a ritual where princes showed off their courts, their wealth, and their mastery of the aristocratic game. Chapter 5. From Mêlée to Joust to Theatre. Throughout the Middle Ages, the tournament itself changed shape. The early heart of it was the open field mêlée. Spectators were mostly whoever lived along the route, and those people often had their crops trampled. But by the 13th century, one part of that chaos started to break away: the individual joust. Jousting had been around for a long time as a side attraction. Two knights meeting lance to lance either before or during a tourney. But it had advantages. It was easier to see, easier to judge, easier to wrap rules around, and over time it started to steal the spotlight and became the star attraction. As jousts became more central, so did the location. By the 14th century, tournaments took place in enclosed lists inside or near towns, with wooden stands for audiences. Writers like Chrétien de Troyes describe ladies in the stands identifying knights by shield emblems. Recognition became part of the show. Heraldry evolved partly because judges and spectators needed to know who they were watching. For townspeople, a big tournament was both thrilling and disruptive. It brought noise, outsiders, business, danger, and bills. Hosting one could be ruinously expensive. A rare female perspective on all this comes from the French romance Perceforest, written in the 14th century. In one scene, ladies who've never seen a tournament watch a mêlée unfold. At first, they're excited. Then, as the helmets get dented and men fall bleeding, they realize how easily their husbands could be killed. Their enthusiasm drains away, and one of them says it looks like war. Around this time, we see a renewed effort in changing safety regulations. Lances, for example, got blunted tips called coronals. Specialized armor also appeared, designed to absorb impact. Swords used in formal combats had their edges ground dull. Then came the passe d'armes, literally passage of arms, which took the tournament further into scripted display. In a classic passe d'armes, knights announced they would hold a bridge, a ford, or some symbolic object like an enchanted forest or a fountain. Anyone who wanted to pass had to fight one or more defenders under set rules. Burgundian court turned this into full-blown spectacle in the 15th century. At the Fontaine de Pleurs, the Fountain of Tears, a lady and her retinue acted out grief beside a fountain while knights fought beneath her gaze. Combat evolved to sit inside a carefully staged scene. Knights like Jacques de Lalaing toured Europe staging this kind of event. He announced feats of arms and passe d'armes, inviting challengers under detailed rules and fixed number of blows. In some cases, he would only face opponents who could prove 4/4 of noble ancestry. These extra rules were meant as gatekeeping, a way to define who truly belonged in the chivalric club. By the end of the Middle Ages, you could still find hard-hitting foot combats with axes and maces, especially in German lands, but the direction of travel was away from chaotic wargames and towards tightly controlled performances of knightly identity. Chapter 6. How it stopped. Tournaments didn't vanish overnight, it was chipped away from several directions at once. First, there was gunpowder. From the 14th century onward, crossbows, early firearms, and disciplined infantry changed the battlefield. Heavy armored knights still mattered, but less and less. By the 16th century, a man in full armor on a horse was more vulnerable to a bullet than to another knight's lance. The tournament could no longer claim seriously that it was a military reenactment. Second, there were the accidents. In 1186, Geoffrey, son of Henry II of England, died in Paris. Chronicler Roger of Howden says he was trampled under horses' hooves in knightly conflict, possibly a tournament. In 1194, Duke Leopold V of Austria was injured when his horse fell on him at a tournament in Graz. His leg was amputated, and he died a few days later of gangrene. Most spectacularly, there was our opening story, Henry II of France in 1559. A king dying from a splintered lance in front of the French elite was impossible to ignore. After that, royal jousting effectively ended in France and soon in other courts too. Third, there was the church. From as early as the Council of Clermont in 1130, popes denounced tournaments. They banned those who died in them from Christian burial, and later councils repeated that condemnation. Preachers called tournaments dens of the every deadly sin: pride, anger, greed, and lust. Enforcement was patchy, but the moral pressure was real. Despite this, kings and nobles kept hosting tournaments, especially once they became key tools of prestige and propaganda. Fourth, there was the cost. Specialized armor for jousting was expensive. So were trained horses, elaborate costumes for pas d'armes, and weeks of feasting for hundreds of guests. Only the richest courts could afford to keep doing this at the highest level. For everyone else, the sums stopped adding up. And finally, we have a cultural shift. By the early 16th century, humanist writers praised a new ideal: Castiglione's cortegiano, the perfect courtier who combined arms with literature, music, wit, and diplomacy. Knocking a man out of the saddle was still impressive, but knowing Latin and how to behave in front of an ambassador was suddenly more important. Tournaments limped on into the 17th century, and in the 19th century we see them revived as historical pageants. But the living tournament world, where young men tried to ransom each other in fields or gain prestige in the lists, belonged firmly to the past. Chapter 7. Why it still matters. So why should we care about men in too much metal hitting each other with more metal? First, because the tournament invented something we still live with: celebrity athlete culture. Knights like William Marshal were professional sportsmen. They built brands, they cultivated fans, they switched patrons like modern players change clubs. Heralds kept rankings, ladies acted as star makers, crowds followed rivalries from city to city. Historian David Crouch openly compares the tournament circuit to modern pro sports. Second, because the code around it never went away. Chivalric ideals hammered into tournament culture: courage, keeping your word, showing mercy, respecting rules even in violence, fed directly into later ideas of the gentleman. In World War I, propaganda posters showed modern soldiers as shining knights. That imagery sank deep into Western military ethics. Third, because the tournament is an easy case study in how societies domesticate violence. It started as semi-regulated mock warfare across open countryside. It narrowed into one-on-one contests with blunted weapons and complex rules. Eventually it turned into stylized pageantry, half theater, half sport. That trajectory looks a lot like the path from bare-knuckle brawling to modern boxing, or from chaotic village ball games to organized football. And finally, because tournaments dominate how we imagine Middle Ages. From A Knight's Tale to Game of Thrones to A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Whenever a show wants to signal medieval, it stages a tournament. Stands full of crowds, nobles in boxes, knights in armor with bright shields. Understanding how tournaments actually worked, the money, the staff, the politics, the women's role, the danger, makes that image much richer. In the end, the medieval tournament was about people in a specific society trying to turn status, fear, faith, love, and violence into something that looked like a game. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. For deeper reading, check out The Medieval Tournament as Spectacle, edited by Alan V. Murray and Karen Watts, and Medieval Chivalry by Richard Coper. Both are in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.